The flames are licking his flesh. The iron bars are searing into his back. The crowd expects screams, pleas for mercy, the breaking of another Christian spirit. Instead, Lawrence of Rome looks up at his executioners and says, completely calmly, "Turn me over. I'm done on this side." The year is 258 AD, and a man is making cooking jokes while being roasted alive by the Roman Empire. The crowd falls silent. Even the hardened Roman soldiers shift uncomfortably. This isn't how executions are supposed to go. The gridiron was designed to break spirits, to make examples, to terrify the masses into submission. But Lawrence is treating his own execution like a dinner party. The flames crackle higher, the iron glows red-hot, and Lawrence continues his impossible calm, his voice carrying across the stunned courtyard. The prefect who ordered this execution is watching from his balcony, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. How does a man joke while dying? How does someone turn the empire's most feared torture device into a comedy stage? The Romans pride themselves on breaking spirits, but something has gone catastrophically wrong. This moment will echo through history. But this story doesn't start here. But how did a Spanish accountant end up cracking jokes while being roasted alive by the Roman Empire? How did a quiet church treasurer become the most defiant martyr in Christian history? To understand that impossible moment, we need to go back 3 days. 3 days before Lawrence would crack jokes on a gridiron, Emperor Valerian signed a death warrant for every Christian in the empire. The parchment was still wet with ink when the orders went out. Kill the bishops. Seize the church property. Make them disappear. Valerian wasn't just persecuting Christians. He was waging systematic war against them. This wasn't the random violence of his predecessors. This was calculated, methodical, efficient. The emperor had studied Christian communities like a general studies enemy positions. He knew their weaknesses, their leaders, their hiding places. The edicts were brutal in their precision. Church leaders were to be executed immediately. No trials, no appeals, no mercy. Christian senators and knights would lose their property and status. If they still refused to sacrifice to Roman gods, they'd lose their heads. Even Christian women from noble families faced exile and confiscation of their wealth. But Valerian's real genius was targeting the church's infrastructure. He didn't just want to kill Christians. He wanted to cripple their ability to organize, to help the poor, to spread their message. Every church treasurer, every deacon, every person who kept the Christian machine running was marked for death. The orders reached Rome like wildfire. Centurions kicked down doors. Soldiers dragged screaming families from their homes. The catacombs, those sacred underground burial places where Christians gathered, became hunting grounds. The sound of hobnailed boots echoed through tunnels that had known only whispered prayers. Christian communities across the empire watched their world collapse. In North Africa, Bishop Cyprian went into hiding. In Spain, entire congregations fled to the mountains. In Gaul, church leaders burned their records and scattered their treasures. The systematic machine of persecution was working exactly as designed. The terror was methodical. Roman soldiers didn't just kill Christian leaders, they made examples of them. Public executions became entertainment. The crowd would gather to watch bishops burn, deacons crucified, church treasurers beheaded. Each death was a message: abandon your faith, or join them. But Valerian had a problem. The Christian church had grown too large, too organized, too wealthy. For 3 centuries, these communities had been building networks, accumulating resources, creating systems that could survive persecution. They had learned to hide, to adapt, to endure. The emperor's advisors had identified the key weakness: cut off the money, and the whole system would collapse. Christian communities survived because they took care of their poor, their widows, their orphans. They ran hospitals, funded missionaries, supported families of martyrs. All of that required money. Serious money. And that money was controlled by a handful of men. Church treasurers who knew where every coin was hidden, every valuable stored, every emergency fund buried. Kill the treasurers, seize the wealth, and the Christian machine would grind to a halt. Valerian's soldiers began hunting these men with particular intensity. The treasurer of Carthage was caught trying to flee the city. The treasurer of Alexandria was betrayed by a former slave. The treasurer of Antioch was found hiding in a grain warehouse. One by one, The empire's most wanted list was getting shorter. The persecution was working. Christian communities were fracturing under the pressure. Some leaders fled. Others went underground. A few even apostatized, publicly sacrificing to Roman gods to save their lives. The empire's terror machine was achieving exactly what Valerian had planned. But the emperor's greatest prize remained free. In Rome itself, the capital of the empire, the center of Christian wealth and organization, one treasurer remained uncaptured. The man responsible for the largest Christian treasury in the world was still free, still dangerous, still undermining everything Valerian had worked to achieve. The hunt was intensifying. Roman soldiers were sweeping through the city, following every lead, investigating every rumor. The reward for information was substantial. The punishment for harboring Christians was death. The pressure was building toward an inevitable confrontation. Pope Sixtus II, the leader of the Roman Church, knew the end was coming. His treasurer, his most trusted advisor, his friend, was the empire's most wanted man. Every day that passed brought the soldiers closer. Every night could be their last. The systematic persecution was reaching its crescendo. Valerian's war machine was about to claim its greatest victory. The treasurer of Rome was running out of places to hide, time to plan, hope to survive. But Valerian's soldiers were about to make their biggest catch yet. The crash of Roman boots on stone, the glint of steel in sacred darkness, the whispered prayers cut short by shouted commands. August 6th, 258 AD. The catacombs beneath Rome had been discovered. Pope Sixtus II was celebrating Mass in the cemetery of Praetextatus when the soldiers found him. The underground chamber, carved from solid rock, had been a sanctuary for decades. Christians came here to pray among their dead, to find peace in the darkness, to escape the empire's watching eyes. Today, it became a killing ground. The Pope didn't run. As the soldiers poured down the narrow stairs, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls, Sixtus continued the sacred ritual. His voice echoed through the stone chambers, calm and steady. Even as the boots grew louder, the shouts more urgent. Lawrence was there. The church treasurer, the empire's most wanted man, was standing just behind his spiritual father when the soldiers struck. He watched the steel pierce the Pope's body. He heard the gasp of pain, the whispered final prayer, the horrible silence that followed. The other deacons died quickly. Felicissimus and Agapetus, faithful servants who had served the church for decades, were cut down where they stood, the sacred space filled with blood and screams. The Romans showed no mercy to anyone who wouldn't renounce their faith. But Lawrence wasn't killed. The soldiers had orders. The treasurer was too valuable to murder in a moment of battle fury. He was to be taken alive, to be interrogated, to be broken properly. The empire needed what he knew. As the soldiers bound his hands, Lawrence looked down at the Pope's body. The man who had ordained him, who had trusted him with the church's greatest treasures, who had become like a father to him, was dead. The grief hit him like a physical blow. But something else happened in that moment. As Lawrence knelt beside the dying Pope, Sixtus whispered words that would echo through history. "Do not weep, my son. In 3 days, you will follow me." 3 days. The prophecy hung in the air like incense. 3 days to live, 3 days to prepare, 3 days to decide how his story would end. The soldiers dragged Lawrence from the catacombs, but they didn't take him to prison. Not yet. The prefect had different plans. The church treasurer was too important to simply execute. The empire needed information. They needed to know where the Christian wealth was hidden, how the network operated, who else was involved. Lawrence was released under house arrest, confined to his quarters, watched constantly, but free to move around the city. The Romans thought they were showing mercy. They had no idea they were giving him the opportunity of a lifetime. The news of the Pope's death spread through the Christian community like wildfire. Sixtus II, the rock upon which the Roman Church was built, was gone. The other deacons, the Pope's closest advisors, were dead. The leadership structure that had held the community together for years had been shattered in a single afternoon. But Lawrence wasn't thinking about leadership structures. He was thinking about the Pope's final words. 3 days. The prophecy wasn't just about death. It was about time. Time to act. Time to make choices that would matter. Time to turn defeat into something else entirely. The Christian community was in chaos. Some were fleeing the city. Others were going underground. A few were even apostatizing, publicly renouncing their faith to save their lives. The systematic persecution was working exactly as Valerian had planned. But Lawrence had advantages the Romans didn't understand. As church treasurer, he knew every hiding place, every secret vault, every emergency fund. He knew which Christians could be trusted, which ones might betray the community, which ones would risk everything to help. He knew the network from the inside. More importantly, he understood something the Romans missed entirely. The Christian community's real strength wasn't in its buildings or its hierarchy, it was in its people. The poor, the sick, the abandoned, the forgotten. These were the ones the church served. These were the ones who would remember. The soldiers were watching Lawrence's house. They were monitoring his movements. They were waiting for him to lead them to the treasure. But they were thinking like Romans, like conquerors who measured worth in gold and silver. Lawrence was thinking like a Christian, and that made all the difference. The 3-day countdown had begun. Lawrence was about to make those days count. Lawrence wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was an accountant from Spain, who happened to be very good with numbers. Born in Huesca, a dusty town in the Aragon region, he grew up in a family that valued precision, hard work, and keeping accurate records. His father was a grain merchant, who taught him that every coin mattered, every transaction had consequences. The young Lawrence had a gift for organization. While other children played in the streets, he was helping his father balance ledgers, track inventory, calculate profits and losses. He could look at a column of numbers and spot errors that escaped trained clerks. He could organize complex financial records with an efficiency that impressed seasoned merchants. But Lawrence also had something else, a quiet faith that burned steady and deep. His family had been Christian for generations, practicing their religion carefully in a world that could turn hostile without warning. They prayed in whispers, gathered in secret, and taught their children to trust in something greater than the empire's power. When Lawrence was 18, a visiting priest recognized his talents. The young man could read and write in multiple languages. He understood complex financial systems. He had the temperament to handle responsibility without seeking glory. Most importantly, he had the faith to serve others before himself. The priest invited Lawrence to Rome. The growing Christian community needed capable administrators, people who could manage the increasingly complex network of charity, support, and missionary work. Lawrence accepted the invitation, leaving his family and homeland behind for a calling he didn't fully understand yet. Rome was overwhelming. The capital of the empire was a city of extremes. Magnificent palaces stood blocks away from crowded slums. Wealthy senators threw lavish parties while beggars died in the streets. The Christian community existed in this contradiction, serving the forgotten while avoiding the attention of the powerful. Lawrence proved himself quickly. He had an intuitive understanding of how to move money without attracting notice. He could organize relief efforts with military precision. He could track complex donations, manage multiple accounts, and coordinate with Christian communities across the empire. Within months, he was handling financial responsibilities that would have overwhelmed experienced treasurers. Pope Sixtus II noticed the young Spaniard's abilities. Lawrence didn't seek attention or credit. He simply did the work, solved the problems, and made sure the community's resources reached the people who needed them most. When the previous treasurer died, the Pope didn't hesitate to promote Lawrence to the position. The promotion changed everything. Lawrence wasn't just managing church finances anymore. He was overseeing a vast network of Christian charity that spanned the known world. Widows in North Africa, orphans in Gaul, prisoners in Spain, missionaries in Britain. All of them depended on the resources Lawrence controlled. The responsibility was staggering. The Roman Christian community was the wealthiest in the empire, receiving donations from converts across the known world. Senators' wives would quietly contribute family fortunes. Successful merchants would tithe substantial portions of their profits. Even some government officials, secretly Christian, would funnel money through intermediaries. Lawrence developed systems that would have impressed imperial administrators. He created multiple accounts, distributed resources across different locations, and maintained records that could be understood by his successors. He knew which Christians were reliable, which ones needed help, which ones could be trusted with sensitive information. But Lawrence's greatest skill wasn't organizational, It was his ability to see the bigger picture. He understood that Christian charity wasn't just about helping individuals. It was about creating a network of mutual support that could survive persecution. Every coin distributed was an investment in the community's future. The treasurer's position also made Lawrence one of the empire's most wanted men. Roman officials understood that Christian communities ran on money, cut off the funding, and the entire network would collapse. They had detailed intelligence about church finances, donor networks, and distribution systems. They knew exactly how valuable Lawrence was. Living under constant threat changed Lawrence. The quiet accountant from Spain developed a sharper edge, a darker sense of humor, a deeper understanding of power dynamics. He learned to think like his enemies, to anticipate their moves, to stay one step ahead of their plans. But the danger also clarified his purpose. Lawrence wasn't just managing money. He was stewarding resources that kept hope alive for thousands of people. Every transaction was a sacred trust. Every decision affected lives across the empire. The Spanish accountant had become something more. He was the keeper of the community's future, the guardian of its most precious resources, the man who made everything else possible. But this accountant controlled something the empire desperately wanted. The summons came at dawn. The prefect had Lawrence exactly where he wanted him. A formal invitation, delivered by uniformed soldiers, requesting the church treasurer's presence at the palace. The language was polite, but the message was clear. This wasn't a request. Prefect Cornelius Secularis was a career politician who had built his reputation on efficiency and results. He had served in multiple provinces, always delivering what Rome demanded. Tax collection, military recruitment, civil order. When problems arose, Cornelius solved them quickly and permanently. The Christian problem was his greatest challenge yet. Emperor Valerian had made it clear that the persecution needed to succeed completely. Half measures wouldn't satisfy the emperor. Cornelius needed to crush the Christian network in Rome so thoroughly that it could never recover. The prefect had studied his enemy carefully. Christian communities survived because they had resources. They took care of their poor, supported their missionaries, helped their martyrs' families. All of that required substantial wealth. Cornelius had calculated that the Roman Christian community controlled assets worth millions of denarii. More importantly, he knew who controlled those assets. Lawrence of Rome, the church treasurer, was the key to everything. Capture him, force him to cooperate, and the entire Christian network would collapse. Without their wealth, the community would fracture, scatter, disappear. When Lawrence arrived at the palace, Cornelius was waiting in his private office. The room was designed to intimidate. Marble columns, gold decorations, portraits of previous emperors. The prefect sat behind an enormous desk, surrounded by the symbols of imperial power. But Lawrence didn't seem intimidated. The Spanish accountant looked around the office with the calm assessment of a man who had seen wealth before. He knew the value of everything in the room, could calculate the cost of the marble, the worth of the gold. Cornelius found his composure unsettling. The prefect opened with carefully chosen words. He acknowledged Lawrence's reputation, his service to the community, his obvious intelligence. Rome didn't want to destroy capable administrators. The empire needed skilled men who could serve the greater good. Then came the proposition. Lawrence could keep his position, even expand his responsibilities. The prefect could arrange for him to manage not just Christian wealth, but imperial finances. Think of the good he could do, the people he could help, the stability he could provide. All he had to do was cooperate, provide information about Christian assets, help identify key leaders, assist in the peaceful transition of church property to imperial control. It was a reasonable request, a chance to serve both his community and his empire. Lawrence listened without interruption. His face revealed nothing. The prefect had negotiated with senators, governors, even barbarian kings. He knew how to read people, how to identify their weaknesses, how to craft offers they couldn't refuse. But Lawrence remained unreadable. When the prefect finished, Lawrence asked a single question. "How much time do I have to consider your offer?" Cornelius smiled. He had expected this. Intelligent men always needed time to process, to weigh options, to overcome their initial emotional reactions. 3 days, he said. 3 days to make your decision. The terms were simple. Lawrence would return to the palace in exactly 3 days. He would bring with him a complete inventory of Christian assets: gold, silver, property, investments, everything. He would also provide the locations of these resources and the names of everyone involved in managing them. In exchange, Lawrence would receive Roman citizenship, imperial protection, and a position in the imperial treasury. His family in Spain would be safe. His friends in the Christian community would be spared. The transition would be smooth, civilized, mutually beneficial. The prefect made the consequences of refusal equally clear. Without cooperation, the persecution would intensify. Every Christian in Rome would be hunted. Every asset would be seized. Every supporter would be crucified. The community would be utterly destroyed. But Cornelius sweetened the deal with a final incentive. If Lawrence cooperated fully, the prefect would intercede with the emperor. The persecution could be reduced, even ended. Think of the lives that could be saved, the suffering that could be prevented. Lawrence nodded slowly. 3 days to gather the church's treasures. 3 days to compile the inventory. 3 days to decide between cooperation and destruction. As Lawrence left the palace, Cornelius felt satisfied. He had offered a reasonable compromise, made the stakes clear, provided adequate time for consideration. The church treasurer was an intelligent man who would recognize the inevitable. The prefect thought he'd won. He had no idea what Lawrence was planning. While the prefect dreamed of gold, Lawrence was emptying every vault in Rome. The 3-day deadline wasn't a time for negotiation. It was a deadline for the most audacious financial operation in Christian history. Lawrence knew exactly what he controlled. 40 years of careful record-keeping had given him precise knowledge of every asset, every account, every hidden reserve. The Roman Christian community was wealthier than most people realized. Donations from across the empire, inheritances from wealthy converts, tithes from successful merchants. The total was staggering. But Lawrence also knew something the prefect didn't understand. Christian wealth wasn't just numbers in a ledger. It was a living system, a network of relationships, a web of mutual support that had been built over decades. Every coin had a purpose. Every treasure had a story. The great liquidation began immediately. Lawrence sent trusted messengers to safe houses across the city. Coded messages went out to Christian families, warning them to prepare for the worst. The network that had been built for charity was now being mobilized for survival. Working through the night, Lawrence and his assistants began moving assets. Gold coins were distributed to families who needed to flee the city. Silver vessels were sold to fund escape routes. Precious stones were traded for safe passage to Christian communities in distant provinces. The operation was masterful in its complexity. Lawrence had learned from decades of managing charitable distributions. He knew which Christians could be trusted with significant resources. He knew which ones had connections outside Rome. He knew which ones would use the wealth wisely. But this wasn't just about preserving assets. Lawrence was implementing a plan that would turn the prefect's trap into something entirely different. If Cornelius wanted to see the church's treasures, Lawrence would show him treasures beyond imagination. The first day, Lawrence focused on liquid assets. Coins were distributed to widows who had lost their husbands to persecution. Elderly Christians received enough money to survive if they had to flee. Families with children got resources to start new lives in safer provinces. The second day, Lawrence liquidated property holdings. Houses were sold to Christian merchants who would preserve them for future use. Warehouses were emptied, their contents distributed to communities that had lost everything. Even church buildings were prepared for transfer to trusted caretakers. The third day was the most dangerous. Lawrence had to move the most valuable items, the pieces that would be immediately recognizable as church treasures. Sacred vessels, ceremonial objects, items that had been donated by wealthy converts over the years. These weren't just valuable objects, they were symbols of faith, artifacts that connected the Roman community to Christians across the empire. Some had been gifts from Christian emperors' wives. Others had been rescued from churches destroyed in previous persecutions. Each piece had significance beyond its material worth. Lawrence's solution was brilliant. Instead of hiding these treasures, he transformed them into something more valuable. The sacred vessels were melted down, their gold and silver distributed to Christian goldsmiths who would create new objects when the persecution ended. The ceremonial objects were broken apart, their precious stones given to Christian merchants who would preserve them for future generations. The operation required trust on an unprecedented scale. Lawrence was asking people to risk their lives, their families, their futures. He was distributing enough wealth to make anyone rich, trusting that they would use it for the community's benefit rather than their own. But the Christian network held. Decades of mutual support, shared sacrifice, and common purpose had created bonds stronger than imperial terror. People who had never met Lawrence personally trusted him because their friends trusted him. The reputation he had built through years of faithful service now became the foundation for the community's survival. By the third evening, Lawrence had accomplished something remarkable. He had liquidated the entire treasury of the Roman Christian community and distributed the proceeds to the people who needed them most. Widows had resources for survival, orphans had funds for education, the sick had money for medicine, the imprisoned had resources for legal defense. The prefect expected to find vaults full of gold and silver. Instead, he would discover that the church's real treasure had been transformed into something entirely different. The wealth was still there, but it was now spread across hundreds of families, dozens of communities, countless individuals who had been strengthened by Lawrence's vision. The deadline arrived. The prefect was about to get the shock of his life. The courtyard fell silent. Then came the shuffling feet, the coughing, the tapping of walking sticks. A procession unlike anything the Roman Empire had ever seen was approaching the prefect's palace. Prefect Cornelius Saecularis waited in his ceremonial chair, surrounded by scribes ready to record the inventory of Christian wealth. He expected chests of gold, wagons of silver, carts loaded with precious stones. Instead, he watched in growing confusion as Lawrence led a parade of humanity's forgotten. They came slowly, these living treasures. Elderly widows who could barely walk, leaning on makeshift crutches, blind beggars who navigated by sound and touch, orphaned children with hollow eyes and patched clothing, lepers whose bandages couldn't hide their disfigurement, the sick, the poor, the abandoned, the forgotten. Lawrence had spent 3 days gathering them from every corner of Rome, not just the Christian poor, but anyone who had been touched by the church's charity, pagan families whose children had been fed during famines, Jewish widows who had received help during persecutions, former slaves who had been given freedom and new lives. The prefect's eyes widened as the procession continued. Dozens became hundreds. The courtyard filled with people who had been invisible to Roman society. Street sweepers, rag pickers, day laborers, prostitutes, beggars, the human refuse that civilized Romans preferred to ignore. Cornelius finally found his voice. "What is this?" he demanded. "Where are the church treasures? Where are the gold and silver?" Lawrence stepped forward, his calm demeanor unchanged. He had been planning this moment for 3 days, rehearsing the words that would define his legacy. His voice carried across the stunned courtyard, clear and strong. "These are the treasures of the church." The silence that followed was deafening. Roman officials stared in disbelief. The crowd of poor people looked around uncertainly, not fully understanding what was happening. Even Lawrence's guard seemed confused by this unprecedented response. But Lawrence wasn't finished. He gestured to the assembled crowd, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You asked for the riches of the church. Here they are. The gold that does not tarnish, the silver that does not corrode, the gems that shine with eternal light." He pointed to an elderly woman whose bent back spoke of decades of hard labor. "This widow has given her last coins to feed orphans." He indicated a blind man whose scarred face told stories of suffering. "This man has prayed for his persecutors, even as they beat him." The prefect's face was turning red with rage and humiliation. This wasn't negotiation. This was mockery. This Spanish accountant was making him look like a fool in front of his own officials. "These are the true treasures of the church," Lawrence continued, his voice now carrying across the courtyard to the gathering crowd of curious Romans. "Not gold that thieves can steal, but souls that shine with divine light. Not silver that tarnishes, but hearts that remain pure under persecution." Cornelius shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "You dare mock the Roman Empire? You think this is some kind of joke?" Lawrence met his gaze without flinching. "I have shown you exactly what you requested. The treasures of the church, the riches that matter most, the wealth that makes us truly rich." The crowd began to murmur. Some Romans were laughing, thinking this was entertainment. Others were looking at the assembled poor with new eyes, perhaps seeing them as human beings for the first time. A few were nodding, recognizing the truth in Lawrence's words. But the prefect saw only humiliation. He had been outmaneuvered by a church treasurer, made to look incompetent in front of his subordinates. The emperor would hear about this failure. His reputation was ruined. The rage building in Cornelius was visible to everyone in the courtyard. His hands were shaking. His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "You want to make jokes? You want to play games with the Roman Empire?" Lawrence remained calm, but there was something in his eyes now. A spark of defiance, a glint of satisfaction. He had accomplished something remarkable. He had turned the empire's demand for treasure into a demonstration of what truly mattered. "I will give you laughter," the prefect snarled. "I will give you games. Let's see how funny you are when you're being roasted alive." The prefect's revenge would be legendary in its cruelty. They came for blood and screams. They witnessed something impossible. The crowd that gathered for Lawrence's execution expected the usual spectacle. A broken man pleading for mercy, weeping for his mother, cursing his fate. What they got instead was a masterclass in defiance that nobody would ever forget. The gridiron was already glowing when Lawrence was dragged into the arena. Iron bars stretched over burning coals, designed to cook human flesh slowly while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. It was Rome's most creative torture device, engineered to maximize both pain and duration. The crowd pressed forward, eager for the show. Romans loved their executions, especially when the victim was someone who had challenged imperial authority. Word had spread about the church treasurer's mockery of the prefect. People wanted to see this arrogant Christian learn respect for Roman power. But something was wrong from the beginning. Lawrence walked to the gridiron without resistance. No struggling, no pleading, no last-minute offers to cooperate. The guards had to force most victims onto the torture device. Lawrence positioned himself as calmly as if he were lying down for a nap. The first flames licked at his body, and the crowd leaned forward, waiting for the screams to begin. Instead, they heard something impossible: laughter. Quiet, genuine laughter from the man being roasted alive. "Is he insane?" someone whispered. "Has the pain driven him mad?" But Lawrence's voice carried clearly across the arena, calm and conversational. "You know, I've been thinking about this for 3 days. I always wondered what it would feel like to be on the other side of the kitchen." The crowd began to murmur. This wasn't how executions worked. Victims were supposed to break, to beg, to provide the cathartic release that justified the empire's cruelty. Lawrence was treating his own torture like a dinner conversation. As the flames grew higher, Lawrence's commentary continued. "The heat distribution is quite even, I have to say. Your engineers did excellent work." He paused thoughtfully. "Though I think the temperature could be more consistent on the left side." Some spectators started laughing despite themselves. Others looked around uncertainly, not sure how to respond. The guards exchanged glances, clearly confused about what to do. Nobody had trained them for this scenario. The prefect watched from his elevated platform, his rage building with each passing moment. This was supposed to be his vindication, his demonstration of Roman power. Instead, the victim was turning it into comedy. The humiliation was complete. But Lawrence wasn't finished. As the iron bars began to glow brighter, he looked up at his executioners with genuine concern. "You might want to turn me over soon. I'm getting well done on this side." The crowd fell silent. Then someone laughed. Then someone else. Within moments, the entire arena was filled with astonished laughter. The victim was making cooking jokes about his own execution. "This is impossible," a Roman senator muttered to his companion. "No human being can do this." But that was exactly the point. Lawrence wasn't demonstrating human endurance. He was demonstrating something beyond human capability. His calm wasn't natural. His humor wasn't normal. His defiance wasn't explicable by ordinary standards. The crowd began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just another execution. This was a man who had found something stronger than Roman power, something that made torture irrelevant, something that turned the empire's greatest weapon into a stage for divine comedy. As the execution continued, people in the crowd began to change. The laughter died away, replaced by something deeper: awe, wonder. Recognition that they were seeing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about power, about suffering, about the human spirit. Some spectators began to weep, others fell to their knees. A few made the sign of the cross, no longer caring who saw them. The execution that was designed to terrify people into submission was having the opposite effect. Word spread through the crowd like wildfire. He's still making jokes. He's asking them to turn him over. He's treating it like a barbecue. People who had come to see a Christian broken were instead seeing faith that couldn't be shaken. The prefect finally had enough. He signaled for the execution to be completed quickly. The flames were stoked higher. The heat became unbearable. But Lawrence's voice continued to carry across the arena, calm to the very end. "Thank you for turning me over. I'm done on this side too." The flames had died, but Lawrence's story was just beginning to burn. And that's how we arrived at that impossible moment. Lawrence of Rome, lying on a gridiron in 258 AD, making cooking jokes while being roasted alive by the Roman Empire. The Spanish accountant who had become the most defiant martyr in Christian history. The crowd that had come for entertainment left in stunned silence. Many never forgot what they had witnessed. Some converted to Christianity that very day, unable to deny the power they had seen demonstrated. Others spread the story throughout the empire, each telling adding to the legend. The prefect's revenge had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking Christian morale, Lawrence's execution strengthened it. Instead of terrorizing the community into submission, it inspired them to greater courage. The torture device designed to create fear had become a symbol of triumph. Emperor Valerian's systematic persecution continued, but something fundamental had changed. The story of Lawrence's defiance spread faster than the empire's soldiers could travel. Christians across the known world heard about the treasurer who had turned the poorest Romans into church treasures, who had faced down imperial power with humor and grace. The wealth that Lawrence had distributed during those 3 days kept Christian communities alive through the darkest period of persecution. Widows survived because of his generosity. Orphans ate because of his planning. Refugees found safety because of his foresight. The treasure he had scattered to the winds became the foundation for the church's survival. But Lawrence's greatest treasure wasn't the gold and silver he had given away. It was the example he had set. He had shown that imperial power, no matter how brutal, could not break the human spirit when it was rooted in something greater than fear. The gridiron became an unlikely symbol of Christian defiance. Artists painted Lawrence's martyrdom, showing him calm and confident, even in the flames. Writers told his story in poetry and prose. Preachers used his example to encourage believers facing their own persecutions. Within 50 years, the Roman Empire would have a Christian emperor. The faith that Valerian had tried to destroy would become the official religion of the very empire that had sought to eliminate it. The church treasures that Cornelius had demanded would be returned, multiplied, and used to build the greatest Christian civilization in history. But it all began with a Spanish accountant who understood that true treasure isn't gold and silver. It's the human souls that shine with divine light, the hearts that remain pure under persecution, the spirits that can't be broken by imperial power. Lawrence of Rome had laughed at fire because he had found something stronger than Rome's ability to inflict pain. He had discovered that faith, when genuine and complete,